December 7, 1941, the American naval base Pearl Harbor was attacked by a surprise Japanese aerial assault. America then proceeded to officially enter World War II the next day. Suspicions began to rise that Japanese Americans living in the U.S. were spies and a threat to national security, and President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, which allowed Japanese, German, and Italian Americans to be incarcerated. Under Order 9066, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt began implementing his plans for rounding up Japanese Americans living in the West Coast, which he referred to as undesirables. 110,000 Japanese were arrested and detained, while only 11,000 Germans and 5,000 Italians were interned. The Japanese-American internment policies unjustly segregated an entire part of the U.S. population based on racist attitudes towards the Japanese. People like Fred Korematsu stood up for themselves and fought the injustice that was happening to Japanese American citizens. He was a U.S. citizen born in Oakland, California, and in 1942 he refused to be put into the internment camps and was arrested. In his trial in 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that the internment was necessary due to national security. However, almost 40 years later in 1983, his case was reopened and overturned when documents were found that the government had hidden from the Supreme Court, showing that DeWitt had made decisions about internment based on race and not on evidence on each individual. On October 7, 1941, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Special Representative of the State Department Curtis B. Munson was commissioned by FDR to investigate the loyalty of Japanese Americans in the U.S. His report, Japanese on the West Coast, known as the Munson Report, said that the Nisei were estimated 90 to 98% loyal to the U.S. and are pathetically eager to show this loyalty. They are not Japanese in culture, they are foreigners to Japan. Though American citizens, they are not accepted by Americans, largely because they look different and can be easily recognized. Munson said that the Japanese Americans in the U.S. were not a security threat, saying, "There is no Japanese problem on the coast. There will be no armed uprising of Japanese." Munson concluded that, for the most part, the local Japanese are loyal to the United States. He recommended some gesture of protection or wholehearted acceptance of this group would go a long way to swinging them away from any last romantic hankering after old Japan. They are not oriental or mysterious, they are very American and are a proud, self-respecting race. Another report was made right after Pearl Harbor on January 29, 1942, by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Ringel, who was particularly well acquainted with the Japanese problem. The Ringel report agreed with the findings of the Munson report and stated that the entire Japanese problem was blown out of proportion, and finally that it should be handled on the basis of the individual and not on a racial basis. He warned that there is a great deal of indiscriminate anti-Japanese agitation stirring the white population, where there are no distinctions made whatever between the actual members of the Japanese military forces in Japan and Japanese born and brought up in the United States. He believed firmly that the only ultimate solution was to deliberately and efficiently encourage the American citizen of Japanese ancestry in his efforts to be a loyal citizen and to help him be so accepted by the general public. Even after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Ringel said that a policy of putting Japanese Americans in internment camps is not only unwarranted but very unwise, since it would undoubtedly alienate the loyalty of many thousands of persons who would otherwise be entirely loyal to the United States. Yet even after hearing these reports, the government still went through with the internments. If the bombing of Pearl Harbor was the match and the Japanese-American internment was the explosion, what was the dynamite that allowed the explosion to be so big? The dynamite was racist attitudes against Asians. But what influenced this racism, suspicion, and even fear of Asians? Dating back to the late 19th century, there has been an underlying plague that has caused prejudice against Asians. A stereotype called Yellow Peril. Yellow Peril is an anti-Asian stereotype showing Asians as evil villains, scheming to destroy the white man. It has been represented in many forms of media, including in newspapers, books, TV, radio, and cinema. There were many films made before World War II that promoted the Yellow Peril stereotype among the public. Such films could be influential in shaping public prejudices against Asian Americans, especially among people who had little interaction with Asians in real life. The most well-known film was The Mask of Fu Manchu, made in 1932. It shows Fu Manchu, the power-hungry Asian villain, trying to wipe out the white race using the mask of Genghis Khan. After all his heinous acts, he ultimately loses to the white protagonist. Quotes like "kill the white man and take his women" appeared throughout the movie. This role of Fu Manchu depicts Asians as sneaky, clever villains hungry for power over the white race. Another pre-war film that promotes Yellow Peril is the 1934 film The Mysterious Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong is a harmless shopkeeper by day, but by night he is a bloodthirsty killer collecting the 12 coins of Confucius. Once he collects the entire set, he can rise to power. This portrayal shows Asians as schemy, two-sided people who seek power using mysterious, foreign, and supernatural ways, further emphasizing that Asians are different and suspicious. After the US had officially entered the war, films started to portray Yellow Peril, showing Japanese Americans, likely to be spies and traitors in the war, taking part in espionage and treasonous acts, even though the stereotype was contradicted by investigations like the Munson and Ringgold reports. One film was the very first Batman film. This 15-episode serial follows Batman and Robin tracking a Japanese-American sabotage ring. There was no fair representation for the Japanese Americans because, in standard comic book fashion, where good and evil are clearly defined in stark black and white terms, the film portrayed Batman and Robin as heroes and Japanese American citizens as the traitorous and stereotypical evil villains. Another film was the 1942 film Little Tokyo, USA. The film follows Mike, an LA cop in 1941, tracking a series of crimes involving the local Japanese American community right before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He finds out that the true purpose of the crimes was to cover a Japanese American spy's secret role in the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese American community's loyalty to America is portrayed as insincere, and the internment of Japanese Americans is seen as a justified response to their treasonous acts, and the public is encouraged to remain vigilant against the Yellow Peril. On July 31, 1980, the Commission on the Wartime Internment and Relocation of Citizens was signed by President Jimmy Carter to review the facts and circumstances surrounding Executive Order 9066. Led by Angus Macbeth, the findings were published into Personal Justice Denied on February 24, 1983. It stated that antipathy and hostility toward the Japanese ethnic was a major factor of the public life in the West Coast states for more than 40 years before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The anti-Japanese agitation also fed on racial stereotypes and fears. The Yellow Peril of an unknown Asian culture achieving substantial influence on the Pacific coast, or of a Japanese population alleged to be growing faster than the white population. Long-existing prejudice against Asians such as Yellow Peril influenced the Japanese American internment policies during World War II. However, anti-Asian prejudices are not just things of the past, they also plague the present. And Yellow Peril is not the only anti-Asian stereotype shown in cinema. For example, there's a stereotype that depicts Asians as buffoonish, like Mr. Yunioshi from Breakfast at Tiffany's. Another portrays Asians as the model minority. But racist stereotypes in film have not only been applied to Asian Americans, but to other groups as well. As the bombing of Pearl Harbor was the match that lit the dynamite of underlying anti-Japanese American racism during World War II, the attacks of 9/11 sparked increased anti-Muslim racism, which was reflected in films and media. Shows like Homeland and films like The Kingdom negatively stereotyped Muslims by always portraying them as terrorists. So why is this important? Because racist attitudes communicated through cinema can influence racist attitudes in the real world. Anti-Asian racism still exists today that was likely shaped by anti-Asian stereotypes in the media. The coronavirus pandemic of 2020 brought out an underlying prejudice against Asians. During the pandemic, there was a large increase in discrimination and assaults against Asians. This prejudice was further incited when President Trump called COVID-19 the Kung Flu and the Chinese virus, in order to put blame for the pandemic on China. What kind of influence did stereotypes like the Yellow Peril, that were propagated in part through movies, have on promoting racist attitudes and tolerance by the public for unjust policies like the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II? Films are a form of communication that can change people's understanding of one another for better or worse. Films leading up to and during World War II depicting the Yellow Peril stereotype influenced the public's view of Asians in a bad way, showing them as sneaky individuals that tried to take power from the white man. They incited undeserved fear and suspicion against Japanese Americans and helped make the pot boil, contributing to the US retaliating in an overly heavy-handed way, depriving individual Japanese American citizens of their rights and freedoms, not based on evidence of wrongdoing, but purely based on their race. During the war, films like Little Tokyo, USA, which could even be considered a propaganda film, helped to justify the government's actions in the public's mind. Racial stereotypes communicated through cinema can influence how people understand others different from themselves, which can lead to racist thoughts, words, and actions.